Hi, Dr. P here, and I'm going to talk about classic tabletop games and uncertainty. Because uncertainty is what you don't have in classic tabletop games for the most part. They are perfect information games, that is, nothing is hidden except player intention. So Go, chess, checkers, or drafts, non-Western versions of chess, tic-tac-toe or noughts and crosses, nine men's Morris, Mancala, all have this characteristic. There are relatively few classic games that have in-game uncertainty, such as backgammon with dice, pachisi with dice, it's a race game, and dominoes with hidden identity. Card games originated much later than these classic games that I'm talking about. So another way to talk about these games would be to say they're deterministic. Certainly they're puzzles. There's always a best move and always correct solution, which is a characteristic of a puzzle. In some cases, it's too complex for any human to solve. Chess is too complex for any human to solve. Tic-tac-toe is very simple to solve. Nine men's Morris is also solvable. Checkers is more or less solved. There was a checkers champion who only lost 7 games in a very long period while he was world champion. He had nearly solved checkers. So, with many of these games, you get a lot of study where people are searching for solutions, trying to find those optimal or deterministic sort of moves. Now that can be off-putting to players who are not intent on making the game a life study, because it becomes a lot of work just to keep up with a game like chess. Lifestyle gamers tend to play one game, study that game, live that game sometimes. And some games tend to be lifestyle games like bridge, Magic the Gathering, chess, Go, sometimes diplomacy. Those are not unusually lifestyle games, whereas many other games are not. Most other games are not lifestyle games. Now, here's an aside. Notice that all these classic games involve geospatial relationships and movement or placement. Games of maneuver and location is another way to put it. That's why we have boards, or the equivalent with the Mancala pits, to track the location and the spatial relationships. Also consider that any one-player game, one person playing against programmed or random opposition, like card solitaire or most single-player video games, is very puzzle-like. That's why you can do speed runs in these video games. After you've played them through, you've solved the puzzle, so you know what to do. And it's why you beat the video game. You've solved it, so there's no point in playing anymore. That's a characteristic of all these kinds of games. And the question here is, how do we change these games to get away from that? To get away from that puzzle aspect or that deterministic aspect. So here are some of the categories I'm going to discuss. I'm not going to repeat each one right now because I'll do it as we go along. Well, the obvious one is to add dice. For example, take a simple chess variant. When a piece attacks, both players roll a die for their piece, and the higher wins. But the die that they roll depends on the piece. So a pawn would be a d3 or a d4, a bishop or a knight a d6, a rook a d8 perhaps, or even a d10, the queen a d10 or d12, or even a d20 if you want. And I think you would have to add 1 to the attacker roll to avoid extreme defensive play. But that would be something that would come out in testing, and I have not tested this game. What about ties? Well, testing would show whether you should re-roll them, or have ties go to the attacker, which encourages attack, or have ties to go to the defender, which discourages attack. Whatever it is, it's sure different from standard chess, just by changing that one element of adding dice. Another way to change classic games to add some uncertainty is to have more than 2 players. Because once you have more than 2 players, uncertainty is more or less multiplied. You could say that uncertainty is a product of the cube of the number of players, something like that. There are 3- and 4-player chess variants, but most of them suffer from turtling. That is, it's better for you not to fight and let the other people fight and kill themselves. The other problem is it's still a perfect information game, and so you're still trying to find the optimal move for your purposes. Another thing you can do is add cards, which is in some ways a variation of adding dice, except that many people feel that they can manage cards better than they can manage dice. They feel more in control. So I have a prototype game that vaguely resembles tic-tac-toe. I've added cards to it that have a variety of functions and also determine play order. Now this is a game for 2 to 4 players and best with 3. So players play cards simultaneously, and then there are initiative numbers on the cards to determine which goes first, and then they have 2 rounds of piece placement, and the pieces can stack. So it's gone a long way away from tic-tac-toe. Of course, it's also a 4x4 board, not a 3x3 board, but it still has elements of tic-tac-toe in it. And one of the major changes is adding cards, and the other is allowing pieces to stack. Take chess as an example for adding cards. Give each player a deck of cards with the numbers 0 through 3. And then they get shuffled and he draws a hand of 5. Whenever there's an attempt to capture, each player plays a card from his hand simultaneously, face down first and then face up, that's added to the strength of the piece. And the strength of the pieces, maybe the pawn is 1, the bishop and knight 3, the rook 4, queen 6. It's the kind of thing that again would have to be determined by playtesting, and I haven't tested it. But these things could be worked out. And when each player has his own deck of cards, in the long run, their luck should be the same. So that might be an interesting variation on chess. Of course, one of the ways to defeat perfect information is to add hidden information. Stratego and the game it derived from, La Attaque, are examples where you're hiding the identities, which is the strengths of the pieces. Now most classic games, all the pieces are the same strength, they are homogeneous. And so hidden identity has limited application. It's also hard to hide movement capabilities. Say you wanted to do that in chess, because you see what the piece is doing, and also conceivably somebody could cheat and move a piece in a way that it's not supposed to be able to move. The other player couldn't tell. Another way to try to avoid deterministic characteristics is simultaneous movement. And you know, I'll say here, I'm using deterministic, but technically, diplomacy, the example here of simultaneous movement, is deterministic. There's no chance in how things are resolved, but there's chance because people don't know what the other players are doing, because it's simultaneous movement. Unfortunately, that's hard to implement on the tabletop. Diplomacy has 7 players, there are only 34 pieces, the systems are simple, so writing orders is relatively easy to do, but it's also a very long game, and it's the kind of thing that would be difficult to sell in 2016. Difficult to persuade people to play a game where they have to write down their orders every turn. It's much easier to do with a computer, of course, especially with a graphical arrangement so you just move your pieces around. Another thing you can do is change to a variable setup. Chess is dominated by a great body of study, thousands of books, because the setup is always the same. An awful lot of those books talk about openings, and they all derive from the same setup. Now, world champion Bobby Fischer advocated a variant that scrambled the pieces in the back row, same arrangement for both players, because he felt that would make players think and not use memorized lines of play. Fischer was a master of that memorized lines of play, but he wanted to force players to think. And this is called Fischer Random Chess, or Chess 960. You can look it up in Wikipedia. Another way to introduce uncertainty, one that dates back at least to the 19th century, if not earlier, is the chess Kriegspiel variant. Kriegspiel just means war game. It requires a third person, unfortunately, to be the referee. The referee has a board with all the pieces on it. The players each have a board with only their own pieces. And of course, they're out of sight of one another and of the referee's board. So they report their moves to the referee, and the referee says what happens. It's completely hidden movement, in other words. Unfortunately, it does require a referee, again something that's much easier to implement in a computer game than on the tabletop. There's a lesson here. If you want to design a game, not a more or less deterministic puzzle, you need to incorporate some uncertainty. That uncertainty can come from lots of things: hidden identity, player intention. When you add more than one player to the, or add a player to the traditional two, randomizers, variable setups, simultaneous play, hidden location. There are more, but that's a good start. A good exercise for an aspiring designer is to modify classic games, like these that are actually puzzles, to make them less deterministic.